So is ChatGPT dead? We're going to break down the generative AI market by the numbers. Meta also took direct aim at OpenAI this week. Microsoft has a new deal with Databricks, TikTok, ElevenLabs, and much more this week on the Generative AI News Rundown. Welcome. All right, I'm Brett Kinsella, host of the Generative AI News Rundown, founder of VoiceBot and Synthedia, and the head writer of VoiceBot.ai. Eric Schwartz is joining me today. How is everybody doing out there?
Excited to break down all the big news.
Absolutely. Okay, folks, I know many of you are just joining. Put a note in the comments. If you're here, let us know you're here. Jump in anytime. And we want to get right into the news today. And one of the things that we decided to lead off with is kind of our top story is market data. And one of the reasons we decided to do this was because it's become fashionable recently to talk down the market. Is ChatGPT dead? What if the generative AI turns out to be a dud? All these other types of things. And so we thought we would say, okay, might be some merit to those. Certainly we're in an early market. A lot of things can happen. But we've been actually running a lot of analysis of data. We've got some of our own proprietary data. We're looking at other people's data. Eric, I know, has been running a lot of stories. And so that's what we wanted to get into first. We just want to talk about, like, what is the case here for generative AI? Why might we think that this actually is got some legs, as opposed to just being like, oh, just another fad? And I think there's a number of things that we have online. And let's just start with our first data point here. And this is one that I think people who have watched earlier Gain will be familiar with, but it bears a little bit of time revisiting. So Bloomberg Intelligence said $1.3 trillion market. That's what generative AI is going to be. Actually, the McKinsey number is quite a bit larger than this, but $1.3 trillion annual business in 2032. And that's up from about $40 billion last year. That's a very large compound annual growth rate. And what do you think, Eric? This is just a data point. It's a forecast. We know it could be wrong, but what's your feedback?
I think this makes sense, especially if you consider how both broad and deep generative AI is proving to be in terms of the parts of a business that it can be used in and how much it can do for some of those businesses. And I think that considering that it's useful for basically any company to have at least some form of generative AI, even if it's only internal, this seems like if anything, a conservative number by the time 2032 rolls around.
Yeah, and just for a little bit more color on this for the people out there. So that Bloomberg forecast wasn't just some sort of top line number that said it's going to go up to 11% of IT spend, although I think that's where it actually settles out. It actually breaks down each of 4 different categories, and then there's some subcategories under those, but we sort of aggregated a few to give you an easier way to view it. And we're looking at the training and inference market. That's what people are paying all the cloud providers for. That's about 85, almost 90% of the business revenue last year, and that's going to continue to grow to be a very large number of about $500 million in 10 years. There's a hardware line item. There's also services along there. There's consulting services, $300 billion. There is software, almost $300 billion in annual revenue. So this does actually break down into a lot of different things, which is great because it'll be testable over time. And so that's one of the things I really like about it. But like if we go a little bit further, we can look at some McKinsey data. Now, McKinsey thinks that the total economic impact just of generative AI, I think it's going to be around $6 trillion annually in the market. And one of the things they did was actually break down the data in much more detail by functional role or functional group within companies and where they're going to have the biggest impact. Eric, you wrote about this in VoiceBot just a couple of days ago. Tell me a little bit about like where the spending is, where the savings are around generative AI in the enterprise.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though, as the scatter plot shows, there's a place for generative AI all over a business operations. The fact is that about 3/4 of the impact will be around either software engineering, customer operations, marketing, and sales. And some of that is software engineering and customer operations. Some of that is about how much they'll be able to make based on their current budgets, and for sales and marketing, some of it's about how much they'll be able to save in terms of the amount of money and resources they spend. But I think it's indicative of, at least for now, where there's a lot of focus for integrating generative AI into businesses. I think there's a lot of excitement about code generation. We see that in the software engineering. There's a lot of excitement about AI customer service operators or internal virtual employees. And I think that's, you see the marketing and the customer operations and even the sales. So I think that as things stand now, this is where the money is going, and whether that lasts for another decade remains to be seen. But it makes sense to me that it takes a lot of time and effort to train a good programmer. So if you can have an AI assistant speed that up, then yeah, you're going to invest in it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a little bit of data on that front in just a couple of minutes. But yeah, so those of you who maybe are just listening on the podcast later or passively with YouTube in the background, software engineering for corporate IT and software engineering for product development are sort of two of the big three there. And if you think about what Microsoft says, in terms of GitHub Copilot, and we've seen this with other people too, they're talking about like 50% plus gains in productivity. The McKinsey study actually puts us in the mid 30s in terms of the percentage impact, or maybe right around 30%. So they're taking a more conservative approach, and that's appropriate because the gains that we're talking about with Copilot is when you're using Copilot for certain types of activities. When you're not using Copilot and other things, you still have other activities. So that's going to be, maybe even if it's true, 50% gains, it's not going to be for all of your activities. So that's like a really important thing to think about. Customer operations, I mean, just this idea that 39% of all of their budget could potentially be reduced. That's like pretty tremendous. And maybe it's optimistic, but still, like, we're starting to see that. And so I think that was a really interesting breakdown, because we have a couple of we top-down analysis from Bloomeberg, but it's actually top-down by segment, and so there's some segments that they're working on. But this actually for McKinsey is a bottom-up analysis. They actually looked at functional capabilities within enterprises, and they took a bunch of different tasks and activities, and they looked at each one individually over, I think it was a couple hundred of them, and said, could this be impact? How much impact it could be? And so they're giving this sort of broad activity. Now, there's another data point here that I thought was particularly interesting as well. And that is a generative AI has a steeper initial adoption curve than other recent technologies. This is out of eMarketer. You also wrote about this week. Tell us a little bit about this idea of what's going on with generative AI. And I think these are US numbers, correct?
Yes. This is based on US numbers. And it was looking at how quickly people are adopting generative AI versus adopting smartphones or tablets. And obviously, it's not a one-to-one comparison, because generative AI doesn't necessarily require new hardware, and there are other differences, of course. But the speed at which people are, at the very least, experimenting with generative AI is genuinely quite impressive. The clock basically starts at ChatGPT, but it goes from 7.8 million users in the first year to 77.8, and then if you look at the curve there, you can see it's racing ahead of how quickly smartphones were adopted by like 60 million people. So it's there's a lot more people using generative AI than there were people using smartphones in the same time period.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. Again, it's just another data point. All these things have assumptions that you have to break into, because there's some forecasting that's going on here, but it's also just like another set of people who are looking at this, and it looks pretty interesting and attractive. Hey, folks, this is Generative AI News Rundown. I know a lot of people join a couple minutes in. It's like very common. Anybody out there on LinkedIn or on YouTube, just let us know you're here. Would definitely be. We definitely love to know you're here. Give us a shout out. Baobali Shetty, thanks a lot for coming in. And also make comments and add your perspective to this as well, because I think there's some really interesting things that are going on with the market data. And this is one of the things that I've looked at a lot throughout my career, really focusing on not the hype, but what do the adoption patterns look like and what's actually happening in the market.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that although this is looking at the broadest possible definition of generative AI and smartphones, remember we covered how when Microsoft started integrating generative AI into Bing, suddenly Bing was relevant as a piece of software on a large scale for the first time since it launched, probably. So it's very much a lifting other boats kind of situation as well.
Yeah, shout out to David Rubino. Thanks for joining us today. Also, yeah, there is the critique of that too. A recent one saying, "Hey, they haven't changed market share at all." So that also potentially, maybe it's true. It's hard to know for sure, but okay, let's say they didn't. It's also only available in the Edge browser. They're like moving it to other browsers, but they initially did it only in the Edge browser. So they were only really going after people that already were using it, and then a few other people. So in any event, we'll see how that goes. Whether Bing is successful or not, I don't think really focuses on or is a good indicator. But we have more data. Let's get to some more things here. Here's another thing that I thought was particularly interesting. So this is from an IBM study of 3,000 CEOs globally. These are mostly large companies, a few maybe larger mid-sized companies. And this is the impact of generative AI on corporate use cases, and particularly on corporate priorities. And that's the thing that I wanted to talk about. So a year ago, these CEOs told IBM that customer experience, 58% sort of said that that was a top priority, product and service innovation, 50%. Environmental sustainability, 48%. So those were your top three. 2023, productivity, which was 45% last year, went up to 48%. So a little bit of a jump, but it is now the top spot because customer experience dropped a whopping 14 points down to 44%. So whereas people are thinking about customer experience heavily last year, they're still thinking about it, but it dropped heavily. And a lot of that is because productivity has come to the fore. Tech modernization at 45% being the second, customer experience. And then we go down to cybersecurity. So if you look at several of these items that were priorities last year, they're not as big of priorities because this idea of tech modernization, generative AI, productivity are really dominating the agenda. And I'll just throw one other thing in here, and you can comment on both of them, Eric. We have this other chart from this IBM study as well. And the question was to CEOs about generative AI adoption pressures. And if you look at it, 2/3 of CEOs said board members are pressuring them to adopt generative AI, probably because of those productivity priorities. Almost 2/3 of investors are. Even 50% of customers are doing this. Medium press, employees, everybody wants to do this. And so when we look at this priorities plus pressure, it looks pretty favorable in terms of what we're going to see from the business spending side of this.
Yeah, I think both of those charts point to, well, that there is as you say, you sort of universal adoption pressure. There's no holdouts from groups. It's the investors aren't saying, "Oh, this is going to lower profits." You don't have the board saying this is going to cost too much money or anything like that. It's everyone's very much on board. And meanwhile, what are they looking at improving productivity, profitability? Which, going back to the earlier charts we were looking at, that's where generative AI may have the biggest impact in terms of not only helping make money, but saving companies quite a lot of money on everything from their telecom costs to their training to even just having to hire people to be librarians who could provide data or find the information for an employee rather than having a generative AI chatbot answer those questions for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, and I'll bring up this other story. So NVIDIA's earnings release, they set records for revenue. So, one of the things I think about, we'll talk about this in just a moment with willingness to pay, but a trend has some legs when people are spending money on it, right? And you also know that, the CEOs, they think 70% think that generative AI is going to have benefits. So CEOs are getting pressure to adopt from a number of different constituencies. They want to do it. They think productivity is very high. Generative AI has these productivity benefits. People are spending money on NVIDIA. And we have this other willingness to pay chart, courtesy of Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. And this is what their estimate is of ChatGPT Plus subscribers as of July of this year, and they peg it at 2 million. Okay, so let's see what this means. So if they have 2 million subscribers at $20 a month, if I look at the math there, right, that's about a $500 million a year business. And if I look at a comment by Brad Gerstner, who's an investment manager who was on the All In podcast a few weeks ago, he actually offhandedly said there are 4 million subscribers. So I don't know who has like inside information here, how they're doing necessarily their modeling, but we have 2 data points recently, within the last month of 2 million and 4 million. If it's 4 million, that's $1 billion annual run rate business. Now I looked at some of the data recently. I think some people had estimated they were spending about $720,000 a day just to keep ChatGPT up and running, which by my estimate is a little over $250 million annually in costs. So if either of these numbers are correct, even if it's half of what A16Z talks about, it's either break even or cash flow positive, and maybe wildly cash flow positive, or on the way to be wildly cash flow positive. So that's one thing. So it's hard for me to say that like this market is dead, ChatGPT is dead. We don't know about retention yet. A lot of people sign up. Will they stick around? But again, this idea of willingness to pay is a really important concept.
Yeah, and it's also, as you said, people willing to spend money, but not just that there is a willingness to spend money. It's where the willingness is coming from, and it's not just startups or consumer focused companies. It's the real blue chip background, the spine of the economy kind of companies that are investing billions of dollars into at least some kinds of generative AI, and both on the visible side and on the invisible back end side of things, which is, I think, often not as exciting to talk about, but is very much a moneymaker for a lot of businesses for a reason. And looking at not only that the CEOs are excited, but that those numbers, whatever it's 2 million or 4 million, that includes a mix of just people using it for fun, and I'm sure companies paying to have their employees have access. I think for a product that was designed partly as just a showcase for what was supposed to be more of an API focused business, ChatGPT is doing quite well by OpenAI.
Yes. Well, and it's driven so many people into using GPT 3.5 for their production environment. There's a lot of other things that I think are really interesting. And Jürgen Gravestein had an interesting point: is high adoption pressure typically indicate over optimism or a fad? Well, it can, but it also can lead to like very significant investment in a space, because like a lot of times we think of a fad as a pejorative statement, but a lot of times fads turn into just like everyday things. Smartphones were a fad at one point, but they seem to have like continued to be important in our daily life.
And fads, or at least transitive fads, often are either limited in terms of how broad they are, or not as widely adopted. And there's a very broad base of adoption here. To me, it's more akin to reading articles from the 70s and 80s about the adoption of word processors, and people scoffing at the idea that it was necessary to pay that much money for something a typewriter could do. And lo and behold, that changed everything about how business is done forever.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, and BioBally has another comment here. Do you have any data on who is spending on these? Is it corporates, is it startups, or individuals? Well, we know that a lot of the startups are spending a lot of money. So like one of the, not the largest, but like a significant player in the LLM space was spending about $15 million a month in cloud services just to train and run some inference on their models. And so that adds up really. I mean, you can get to billions of dollars very quickly for just a few of the leaders in this space. But we also know from Microsoft data that 4,500 companies as of May were already using OpenAI services through Azure. We have Amazon Bedrock just put out some numbers, which I think said that over 1,000 people have been using Amazon Bedrock and the models that they're hosting. So, I think the numbers would suggest that it's both corporate and startups, and the Amazon numbers might have more startups in there, but there's not all that many startups ultimately compared to like the corporation. So when we get into thousands and thousands, I think it's, we're looking at something which is much more likely to be, more broad corporate adoption. Now, the other thing too is a lot of these are POCs, and so there's another interesting data point, which like just build on this for BioBally's comment, is that S&P 500 intelligence or analytics, whatever the research firm is, research group, said that 70% of companies in the S&P 500 said they're doing something with generative AI, which is like astounding. But then they said, oh, but almost all, or half of them can't get it to production. Like it's in POC. I'm like, but 70% are doing something. And it, some POCs don't go to production, but if they're just because they're having trouble scaling it, doesn't mean that it's not going to be a runtime capability next year or the year after. So we just see like this adoption. It's like, it's kind of crazy. And we have this other one too. There's some data out of Stack Overflow, a avowed generative AI skeptic for 6 months, and maybe less so now, maybe embracing it. Hard to say. They put something out that said like 54% of developers were using GitHub Copilot. Is that what you wrote about?
Yeah, the idea is that in the last year, GitHub Copilot has been regularly used by the people who are surveyed by Stack Overflow, which does a really big developer survey every year. So, regardless of the numbers of people using these kinds of tools, GitHub Copilot is well ahead of any other option.
Oh yeah, and I think actually, I'm trying to recall what this was. So it's somewhere around half of people have tried these, and 54% are using GitHub Copilot. But I actually looked into the numbers. It's actually a little bit misleading. I think that it's probably more like 2/3 because there's like some of the ways they actually look at their data. But if you look at it there's another way to look at it where it's actually, it's probably 85 or 90% because they don't really talk about intensity of use. Just because you've tried one of these things and then you normalize it as opposed to, to add up. And these numbers don't even add up to 100%. So there's a few things about this that I didn't like, but they did have something that I thought was pretty interesting, which was also in your article. And this is this idea of what it's what they try and what they like, but they have like a more clever packaging for it.
Yeah, they refer to it as admired and desired. Admired meaning that it's been used and that someone plans to keep using it, versus desired, which is that someone plans to use it in the future but hasn't yet done so.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at the data here, we're like in the 70% range for GitHub Copilot for admired, and then even mid 70s, a little bit higher for desired. And then if you look at like Code Whisperer, which is something that's high in the desired, it's, the admired is like much lower. Like everything's much lower in terms of trial and in terms of intent to try.
Yeah, and GitHub's the only one that has a desired rating higher, meaning that it's the only one of these that has more people who want to try it that haven't done so, versus the other ones where there are more people who have tried it than have been wanting to do so and that haven't had a chance yet. So more growth for GitHub right there.
Yeah, and one of the great use cases, and even Gary Marcus, who I've got a post coming out today, like talking about how he's been talking down the market quite a bit, is agrees that the code generation piece looks like a breakout success. I think where he and I maybe differ is that I'm seeing success in a lot of other places. And some of that might be because I talk to a lot of more enterprise users on a regular basis. At least I think I do, based on what he does on a daily basis. And so I know what they're doing. And I know their level of interest. We got something with Telefonica, which will be on the podcast, I think today, where, they're running sort of a big trial. And is that a POC? Yes, but it's actually the scale of that POC is pretty large. And it's very likely that becomes a production system next year. So there is a question here about data USA versus Europe versus Asia. I actually don't have that in today's. In fact, that's all the data we have for you today. But we'll look for that, because that's a good that's something that would have been that'll be nice for our next data deep dive when we do that on Gain in a few weeks.
Yeah, the markets are very different, especially because the policy and regulation state of things is very much in flux right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's our data deep dive. We're going to do this from time to time. If anybody, we'll try to put some of the links in the comments as well, so you guys can actually go and read the stories. But Eric's been writing basically a data story every day on voicebot.ai. So why don't you go take a look at that? And if you haven't signed up for Synthedia, we talk about data a lot in there. That's the daily generative AI strategy and tech newsletter that I put out. And I have one coming up on data and sort of the skeptical view and the optimist view of the market right now. And we want to have that balance. We want to hear both. I'm not convinced by the skeptics right now, because I've been through this before with some different things, and I have a sense I know what a good market looks like, and this looks like a pretty good market. But okay, so that's good. So we took a lot of time on that. And so that was our top feature story. We actually have another feature story today, and that's about Meta. And Meta, what I'll say is they took direct aim at OpenAI. Now, not to say that they haven't taken direct aim before, but Whisper is an automated speech recognition system by OpenAI, which they open sourced last fall, but now they have a proprietary API for it. Really good, 100 languages, exceptional, can do some things around translation as well. Meta this week launched their own product. Tell us about it, Eric.
Yes, this is the Seamless M4T, which broadly speaking is a generative AI a model for translating languages. There's almost 100 languages available there. It's for not only text to text, but text to speech, speech to speech, and the idea is that instead of having to build up multiple models for all these different languages, you can use this single model that has all the languages in it, which is something that Meta has done a lot of research on. I've written over the last few years about various projects that are similar to this, but now Meta is really going all out with a big AI model and one that is available to anyone. So again, which ties into Meta's recent strategy of open sourcing and avoiding any sort of business licenses, although in this case there's no business version, but they're trying to outmaneuver Microsoft and Google and others that are approaching these markets with more of a closed model system that people pay for. And Meta's saying, hey, just use our model. You can see how we do it, and then of course there's opportunity for Meta to snap up more of the market and create products that can be sold within that space. But it's really impressive what they've done with the translation tools. As you can see in that chart right there, it's just without any additional work by other developers, it's already capable of doing voice cloning in multiple languages. It's capable of synthetically translating what people are saying, and not only that, but understanding what language someone is speaking without having to adjust any settings. You don't have to say.
That's really interesting as well. This idea that people will be able to speak any language and it'll automatically. It's always listening. It's going to figure out very quickly. They've got just under 100 languages. totally supported. And, in this document, it shows basically that Seamless 4MT, which is the name of this open source model, beats two different versions of the Whisper model in terms of different sizes. By something that's meaningful. It's not like it's twice as good, but it's like meaningfully in terms of their tests. And then it also for speech to text, for speech to text, and for speech to text, it beats them, and also for Audio Palm 2, which is Google's. And I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting about this, Eric, is that we've got OpenAI that has this full suite: text to image, text to text or large language model, text to video, text to 3D, right? They have a new music and audio generation thing in the works. So they're basically trying to cover all their bases. In this case, we've got speech recognition and then translation. And Google has the full suite as well. So they've got all of it. Surprisingly, like NVIDIA has most of it, and maybe they will have all of it. In fact, they've got some things that the others don't have because they're much more tactical in terms of how people can deploy it. Like these things like audio to face, for example, sort of match up movements of avatars with what's going on the screen. But then we have Meta. Meta's out there, and everybody else has that has the full portfolio, has a proprietary suite. Meta is focused on open source. They think that's going to be a differentiator. And what Zuckerberg has said is, he said, hey, if I can get basically more developers working on Meta technology, they're going to help improve it. And that's going to help us because we're deploying these as part of our platforms, and they become products, and we want this thing to get better. And then there's the altruism about, just making the technology available for everybody.
Yeah, well, and it fits with Mark Zuckerberg has talked a lot about his vision of how technology as a business should function. And, the metaverse, as he described it and had been building it, may not be the thunderbolt that he was hoping for, but the concept of Meta will build your universe, will build the space, and then it can be populated with things that people pay for. That feels very similar to this sort of foundational open source approach with then products built on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Boy, I keep having lag here. I've got to figure this out. So a little bit of lag. Sorry about those of you who are viewing. Those who are listening, this won't be any problem. I do have a little lag today, and I did last week too. So I'll assume it's me. Okay, let's move on to the next story. I want to talk about Microsoft and Databricks. And there's an actual product on Azure for Databricks, for ML, and it's got some things in there where they start mentioning large language models. I mean, there's this rumor that there's a bigger deal in the works. And, where this becomes maybe significant is there's like a breathless headline from a particular publication that's like, this could hurt OpenAI, right? So if Azure is working with Databricks and Databricks has like Mosaic ML, LLM, that's going to compete with OpenAI, and they'll get less business from Azure folks. But Azure's not exclusive with OpenAI. OpenAI is not exclusive with Azure. Both the top executives have said those things. And frankly, it's a cloud service provider. Everyone expects everything to be there. And if you need to have a open source model option, Azure already has Llama 2. They were the first ones to get that. I'm not even sure if anybody else has it yet in terms of like a public hosting solution. And now they're going to have one with Databricks, and makes a lot of sense to me. Go proprietary, go with the market leader, OpenAI, or go with your favorite open source model, but you can do it all in Azure because Azure cares about Azure revenue.
Yes. And it goes both ways, I think, because Databricks, I mean, it's not Microsoft, but it's not a small company either. And they've been very keen on employing their enormous amounts of data
exactly.
looking for ways to combine it with generative
AI. It's a great point. I mean, they're a tooling company. Like a lot of people are using Databricks with things like OpenAI in order to do data readiness and package their data up. This is like a perfect example of like, people thinking that like big tech, they all compete with each other because they all have some sort of overlap in their technology.
Yeah, and this kind of partnership, which I'm sure has been in the works for a while, makes Databricks the news that Databricks is spending $1.3 billion to buy a generative AI startup, Mosaic ML. Suddenly, that number makes a lot more sense if they knew that this much bigger project was in the works and will be a lot easier to implement with Mosaic ML's team on their side.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's an interesting story. You had another one this week, and we'll just go right into OpenAI. So OpenAI has some new features around GPT 3.5, Turbo, and GPT 4. What's going on?
Yeah, so it's not hugely shocking news. It's something that OpenAI had mentioned was in the works, but is now actually out. That there's more fine tuning available for the APIs for GPT 3.5 Turbo, and in a few months, or maybe just a couple months, for GPT 4. So for the APIs for the companies that are paying to access and use these models, but within their own systems. So now they'll be able to have these APIs, train them on their own data, give them more specialized functions, and otherwise just have better services from them. And the idea is, from OpenAI's point of view, is that you'll have it'll be cheaper overall because it'll be more efficient and again, finely tuned for a specific business, which is why the cost is a little higher for the fine tuned versions. But if you're a company that has been finding success with these APIs, but now want to go to the next level, then fine tuning is what happens next. So this makes a lot of sense for both sides of that equation.
Yes. And it seems it's kind of fun because we're getting into the mundane phase of the adoption, because it was all like these breathless statements about our large language model and 100,000 token context window and stuff like that. And what we're seeing, like 70% of S&P 500 companies have a generative AI project, at least in POC, some in production. We see the pressure from the board, all that data that we just talked about. What happens is people can try this in a sandbox. They can do like a little dabbling. But at some point, when they need to go to production, they need all these other things. They need Databricks for managing their data or another tool. They need LangChain. They need weights and biases for monitoring and reporting. And they need additional tools from the big players, which aren't as exciting, but it's this transition from the what to the how. So dabbling with what we can do. And now it's like, how do we actually get it to work consistently?
Yeah, and it shifts from power to technique, essentially, where the question is not, can the LLM perform what we want it to do? The question is, can it perform better for us specifically, rather than just being, bringing brute force algorithms to the table. And personalization, fine tuning, those are all part of that aspect. And again, the higher costs theoretically being offset by better performance and more efficient operations.
Absolutely. All right, folks, you are watching GAIN, the Generative AI News Rundown. We do this every week at 11 a.m. Thursday. We talk about the top stories of the week in generative AI. We give you a little bit more background. Some people I know use it as just like a quick catch up, so they don't have to read all the articles. Other people like the additional commentary we have here, but we try to put as much into the or we try to put like in the comments like links if you want to go more. Plus, if you just sign up for Synthedia, I do a summary of this with a link to the recording of this show every week on Friday. So just you can just go to bit.ly/Synthedia to see that. I'm Brett Kinsella, founder of Synthedia and VoiceBot.ai. We've been doing this for a long time. Eric is the head writer at VoiceBot.ai. And if you're on LinkedIn or if you're on YouTube, and I know you're out there because I can see some of you, please give us a like on that channel and make a comment. Let us know you're here, or add to the discussion. Olya just asked transition from the what to the how. Yes, exactly. I think that's where we are, because people really want to turn that productivity dream into productivity realized benefits. And like there, along these lines of tooling, we have another story that you talked about this week from the Allen Institute, and they released this an open text data set. Um, tell me a little bit more about that and how that sort of fits into this idea of tooling what to how.
Yeah, there's more and more questions about or interest in open source, transparent, moving away from being impressed with what generative AI can do and more focus on how is it doing it, or how can it do it better. And the Allen Institute has been obviously been focused on AI for a long time, but now they've created a data set that they want researchers, developers to use for creating LLMs and improving existing LLMs. And it's all text. It's called DOLMA, and it's also a precursor for what the Allen Institute is planning of in terms of their own LLM. But it's a really impressively large and sort of comprehensive data set. And but beyond that, I mean, as I said, it's 3 billion tokens, which is a lot. Not necessarily as nearly as large as what OpenAI or Google have available, but because it's totally transparent, and because it explains where its sources are, because it explains how and what it filters, people could, or companies certainly could, trust it more theoretically, both as something that won't cause problems if a customer is interacting with a chatbot based on it, and also avoiding some of the growing number of lawsuits from those whose books or other content has been used for training an AI without their permission or awareness. So, yeah, it's kind of an exciting thing. I think it's going to be foundational for a lot of certainly open source models in the future.
Yes. And I think if we look at the EU AI Act, it might be that things like this data set will be necessary. At least there's a transparency reporting requirement, and we'll see what actually comes out of the final regs. But and that includes things about talking about the data that you used, how it was used, what's in there. And so I think this data set I think is interesting because it's like, okay, here's something that I could potentially use that that complies with the EU AI Act as it's written would be my position right now.
Yeah, it's very in keeping with I think the mood at the moment for more transparency in AI. And yeah, as you said, the regulations are not set yet, but they're definitely leaning toward the more open side of things, at least in Europe, and thus potentially in the US as well.
All right. So staying on that regulation topic, legal regulation, all of the unknown risks out there. A federal judge rules generative AI works ineligible for copyright. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this has been sort of an ongoing issue, both for copyrights, for patents, for trademarks. The question is, if a work or a product is made mostly or entirely using AI, can it be copyrighted or patented? And there's been one genuinely passionate AI developer named Stephen Thaler who's been putting out patents and copyright requests for all kinds of AI generated materials, and has been slapped down basically nonstop by every court he's gone to. And in this case, the U.S. Copyright Office said that you have to have some human authorship to copyright something, and the judge, the federal judge in this case, agreed with that and said that you can't just ask an AI to create a new image or a new idea, or build up an idea and then copyright it without saying that a human did it. You can't say that the AI did it. So, yeah, it's not ideal for those who want to maybe create their own. There's an earlier case involving a comic book where all the art was AI generated with similar results, and I think that it's going to help shape the generative AI content of the future, the synthetic media future. But I don't think this fight is totally over, especially as more people learn and understand what AI can do. But I think for now, at least, it's looking like the door is pretty well shut on AI generated copyrights.
Geez, the prompt isn't enough. I mean, can I copyright my prompts or my prompt foundation model pair? Okay. So oh, actually, before I get into, like, we've got just two more stories, then we'll get to winners and losers of the week. And if you're not familiar with that, this is where Eric and I pick one company that we think is a winner in generative AI, one which is a loser in generative AI of the week. And I don't even know what mine are for this week. I'll have to figure it out for shortly. But if you're in the audience and you think someone is a big winner this week or a big loser, put it in the comments. We'd love to see it. We'll try to talk about that as well. All right, so we have another story here about ElevenLabs. So ElevenLabs, a synthetic voice company, famous for voice clones, like, big momentum in the market. Just raised a big funding round. They have this multilingual solution. I thought it was really interesting that this came out the same week as Meta's Seamless 4MT, because it's just like, oh, okay, so now it's not that we haven't been like just in one language or something like that, but people are actually thinking about, okay, very practical things like, if I have something, can I publish it in English and Spanish and French and Korean, et cetera? So tell us a little bit about what ElevenLabs is doing and how that might be different than what we've seen in the market before.
Yeah, so as I said, ElevenLabs recently raised a bunch of money, about 19 million, and they made a big splash because, at least for a little while, they were offering for free their voice cloning tool, which was like all voice cloning tools, not perfect, but relatively good, to the point where it was causing some people to be confused about what was real and what wasn't, and led to some more guardrails from ElevenLabs about how their technology is used. But it was all leading to what they've just put out of beta, the Multilingual V2, which, as you said, much like Meta, it's a multimodal, multilingual AI that can translate what you're saying into different languages, that can understand every language without you having to set it up first. If you just start speaking in one of the 28 languages it has available, it'll figure out what language you're speaking in order to start transcribing it or translating it into something else. It's a really powerful tool, and it's a really useful one for a lot of content creators in video games.
Does this like expand their market significantly? I mean, it's just because there's like a lot of synthetic voice companies, like they're a little bit different in terms of quality, but they all basically do the same thing.
Yes, I think it does, but partly because the company itself, although it's technically American-based, the founders are Polish. Polish is notoriously a very difficult language to translate, and it's also in Europe, where there are, as a lot of languages geographically close to each other, and even if you learn 2 or 3 or 4, that doesn't mean you speak all of them. And it's useful to be able to, if you're a content creator, if you want your book or your TV show to be understandable in a larger market, then better translation, better transcription is a key tool for that. So there's definitely a market for this overall, which is why we see so many versions or so many competitors in this space. But I think ElevenLabs does have a leg up in some ways because of partly because of its notoriety, and partly because it's already made some good partnerships. We wrote a while back about them working with DID, the generative AI video company, which has been developing real-time generative AI voice conversations, and now the idea that you can then augment that with different voices and different languages. There's a lot of power there, I'd say, but it's certainly not going to be without rivals.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so let's do before we get into winners and losers of the week, let's talk about ByteDance. And many people know ByteDance owns TikTok. They released a generative AI chatbot, and you were looking at it like, oh, this is interesting. How is this going to flow into the second most popular, the fastest growing social media app out there?
Yeah, like a lot of Chinese tech companies that have a presence in outside of China, there's sort of like the Chinese face and then the international face. And TikTok is obviously very international. ByteDance is the parent company, and they've put out a generative AI conversational app in Chinese for the Chinese market called DouBou. It has a lot of the capabilities of ChatGPT, things like that, except with more specialized versions. So it's the idea is it's an app with multiple personalities. So there's one that's for learning English. There's one for more social activities. There's one for work tasks. But the fact that ByteDance has this means that it would be relatively easy for it to adapt it to its other subsidiary companies, including TikTok. And I've written before about there's early experiments on TikTok of a generative AI chatbot. But it's a very small trial right now in the Philippines. But if this is if this already exists in China for ByteDance, then yeah, we could have that on the TikTok app. Although based on the experience that Snapchat's having with theirs, ByteDance may be wanting to hold back until they can figure out what will make people more comfortable using combining social media with generative AI.
Yeah, I don't think TikTok's going to hold back for fear. I mean, maybe if they think there's going to be regulation, but I think they're going to push the edge probably. So the thing that I thought was particularly interesting here was, okay, yeah, so they have a chatbot. Okay, like of course, and they're using generative AI. I was thinking of two things. One is ADOT in South Korea from SK Telecom, which is has generative AI back, and it has other things as well. But it's basically this personal companion, and it has a personality, and super popular. And it looks like, I mean, in the US and Europe, we have a lot of these solutions which are just like, they're beige, right? It's just like chatbot, generative AI, actually Anthropic Claude 2 is beige. It's the color of the background. But it's just like they don't have a personality. They're not trying to be a companion. They're a tool, which makes a lot of sense, because I think that, a lot of times these voice assistants spend too much time on that. On the personality and not enough just on the functionality. But in this space, we already have like a lot of functionality, and personality matters. And I think this idea that they're going to come out with characters to start, or they have characters to start, it really changes this, because generative AI is great for all these work tools and everything, but it's also really good for entertainment or leisure activity type of thing. These personal companions, particularly if they get to know you and customize over time. This is a whole different area that like people aren't talking about, and maybe it'll be popular, maybe it won't be, but it strikes me that this could be much bigger than anything else that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I agree. I think as much as it does feel like the money is in enterprise, as with so much of AI technology, adoption on the consumer side will just accelerate what happens on the enterprise side. So it all works together. If the next crop of new hires or new interns are comfortable with generative AI because they've been playing on TikTok, then suddenly it's a lot faster to see those charts we were looking at earlier come to life.
Yeah, and if we look at character AI, I mean, they've been like insanely successful getting people to come and use their chatbots, even though I think they're like mostly pretty mediocre experiences. If we get something that's more personalized, more fun, a better companion, I think that like will really take things up a notch. All right, Eric Schwartz, winners and losers of the week. Who's your loser this week in generative AI land?
I'm going to say Google for an interesting reason that not one, but two startups featuring former high-ups in Google AI research have come out this week. Sakana, which I wrote about earlier, and a new one called Ideogram. Both have the co-founders are and other executives are veterans of Google AI research. There's people who've worked on their Imagine text to video and other tools, and it feels a bit like a brain drain away from Google. And it could just be a purely business monetary reason that they've moved on. But it's notable that it's they're not coming from multiple places. These are all Google AI researchers.
It's a brain drain, and I think it is negative. One of those prominent departures basically said, it's not like an innovation factory anymore. And I saw something recently by by Peter Thiel, like really talking about this in terms of, Google was doing moonshots at one point, and like now they're sort of they're moving back to this idea. It's like flying cars to 140 characters, right? Maybe in some ways less ambitious because they're just trying to make things work. So I think that's a really fair statement. And I actually had Google for a different reason, but I'll actually change it up. I'll tell you my different reason for Google is that, particularly Meta coming out with all these open source models, it's going to make it harder for them to get traction. They already have an issue that they're behind OpenAI, which has a ton of momentum in the market. And all these open source models are just going to make it easier for people to try something that's not Google. So like, what's the alternative here? So I think there's a compounding problem for Google right now. They've got the startups, they've got OpenAI, they've got Microsoft against them, and now Meta is just like trying to undercut them. And that goes back to this whole idea of that we wrote about a long time ago, and it's still one of the most popular posts on Synthedia, and that's Google has no moat. The internal memo by one of the engineers there saying, "Hey, listen, like we've got problems here with the open source side." But I'll just throw one other in there. I say maybe OpenAI, they've sort of had largely a free playing field leadership in some of these areas. When we talk about Whisper and ASR, I think that this seamless 4MT from Meta, I think is really something that's going to be an issue for them because they're killing it with the large language model. They did not do well with DALL-E versus Stable Diffusion. We'll see how that plays out long term. But we have another area where they hadn't really established dominance yet in this ASR space. Having this open source alternative, I think, is going to be a big deal. All right, so my winner for this week is NVIDIA because, wow, they're like a cash machine. Also, like Synthedia, I was like, NVIDIA is the giant of generative AI. I liked that post like 6 months ago. That's still super popular. People are still reading that. And it's, they've got the full portfolio. They've got the hardware, which is just like a cash machine that's funding everything else. I think we're talking about a company that made a bet, and that bet is already paying off.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've put NVIDIA at the top several times, but in this case, I'll say that musicians may be sort of a winner in that we've talked a little bit before that there was some discussion about how to protect musicians and artists and their cash flow from generative AI, and now YouTube is apparently jumping into the discussions, but with a specific focus on protecting music rights, which is important and for musicians, and will be kind of key to shaping that market going forward. If it's if you can't just create your own fake versions of songs without consequences. So if YouTube takes a stand, then musicians will have a better shot of surviving the shift into synthetic media.
Yeah, I think they will benefit from that. Although the rights holders, Universal Music, Warner, Sony, they're going to be the real beneficiaries of it. Let's face it. I mean, that's sort of the way these things always go in the music industry. It's not, some of that trickles down to the users. All right, folks, that is another episode of GAIN, the Generative AI News Rundown. We do this every week at 11 a.m. Join us live next week if you get a chance. Otherwise, you can watch the recordings in YouTube afterwards. We have them every week there. Sign up for the Synthedia newsletter, read voicebot.ai. Thanks so much for coming out today. We really enjoyed it. And thank you, Eric. Oh, as always.
Thank you. Can't wait for the next one.
All right, folks. Bye-bye.